The influence of anti-cult groups on law enforcement agencies. The Waco tragedy, which occurred in the spring of 1993, left a profound mark on U.S. history and continues to spark heated debates. This tragic event, which resulted in the deaths of dozens of people, including children, was not just a national disaster, but a clear example of how anti-cult groups can manipulate the law enforcement agencies of democratic states, turning them into tools for human rights suppression. The foundation of the tragedy was laid long before the siege began. At the center of the events was the religious group Branch Davidians, led by David Koresh. This community peacefully resided at the Mount Carmel Ranch in Texas, adhering to their religious beliefs and not breaking any laws. However, the group became the target of an aggressive informational campaign organized by anti-cult activists. The methods used against the Davidians, such as labeling, dehumanization, and guilt by association, are classic tactics employed by anti-cultists to persecute targeted groups and carry out informational terror attacks. Supported by the media, anti-cultists deliberately demonize the community, portraying it as a dangerous sect, accusing it of child abuse and illegal arms possession. Despite statements from the sheriff that no evidence of child abuse was found, and Koresh's offers to law enforcement to come and inspect the weapons and licenses in person, the deliberate harassment of the Davidians continued. The consequences of anti-cultist influence. Anti-cult groups, using methods of dehumanization and labeling, skillfully implanted in the minds of the public and authorities the image of Koresh as a dangerous cult leader. These false narratives became the foundation for the actions of law enforcement, which ultimately led to catastrophic events. A significant role in escalating the tension was played by the anti-cultist and deprogrammer Rick Ross. His recommendations and influence on law enforcement officials led to the operation at the ranch being carried out with excessive force and aggressive methods typically reserved for armed terrorists. As a result of his influence, law enforcement abandoned peaceful negotiations and shifted to tactics that included aggressive, psychological pressure on those under siege, contributing to the tragic outcome. Federal agents, manipulated by anti-cultists, chose a tactic of dynamic entry, which led to a violent confrontation and ultimately to the deaths of 76 people, including 25 children, infants and toddlers under 3 years old. A thorough and detailed analysis of the incident is provided in the Impact documentary. The results of this tragedy were catastrophic not only for the participants, but for the entire American society, which watched the siege unfold live on television. Trust in law enforcement and government agencies was severely undermined, and the event became a symbol of the erosion of U.S. democratic values. The Waco tragedy stands as a stark example of how anti-cult organizations can exploit law enforcement to achieve their goals, causing significant harm not only to individual citizens, but also to the country as a whole by undermining the core democratic foundations of the state. This tragedy, in essence, constitutes an act of genocide carried out by anti-cultists through the hands of the authorities and law enforcement agencies. As a result of anti-cult propaganda and their manipulative influence, law enforcement agents, who were supposed to protect their fellow citizens, became executors of inhumane actions comparable to Nazi crimes. One of the most disturbing aspects of this tragedy was how skillfully anti-cultists managed to brainwash law enforcement officials, leading them to perceive innocent people as a threat. Federal agents committed physical, psychological, constitutional, and judicial violence against American citizens, whom they had come to despise and dehumanize as members of a dangerous cult due to manipulations by anti-cultists. The critical question here is how dangerous such manipulable individuals can be when given the power to make decisions about the use of force. The influence of anti-cultists is not limited to the U.S. Similar manipulations occur in other countries, where anti-cult activists, under the guise of public education, actively infiltrate government, judicial, and law enforcement structures. They give lectures and provide consultations for civil servants and law enforcement agencies, including police academies and security force management, where they stigmatize religious and social groups as threats to society and proudly boast of their influence, all while violating fundamental democratic rights. Here is a quote from one of the leaders of an anti-cult group in Russia. "I have been collaborating with law enforcement and military agencies for many years, giving lectures to personnel about the essence of modern sectarianism, knowledge of which is extremely weak in society, and this is despite the fact that the church pays the utmost attention to anti-sectarian activities. I have been dealing with this issue for 30 years. During my talks, I often explain a lot to cadets, security officers, and military personnel." A Novopashin. Such public activity by anti-cultists is merely a preparatory stage for further involving law enforcement in the suppression of religious and social groups, which have already been labeled as sects and cults by anti-cultists. Under the guise of education, they instill in law enforcement the belief that those they have branded as cultists, in some countries it is sectarians, are a threat to society, thus creating an enemy image in their minds. Examples like the Waco siege raise serious concerns. Imagine a law enforcement officer, manipulated by anti-cultists, who sees not a citizen they are sworn to protect, but an enemy. How will they perform their duty? Will they act the same way as the law enforcement agents did during the Waco siege? This situation highlights the issue of psychological lability in individuals endowed with power, particularly those with the authority to use force. When such individuals fall under the influence of anti-cultists, they can become dangerous tools in the hands of these manipulators. They engage in actions that cause irreparable harm, not only to innocent citizens, victims of anti-cultism, but also to the entire country by undermining the fundamental principles of democracy. Such actions of anti-cultists are aimed at inciting widespread discontent with the government, fueling civil protests and fostering confrontations. Anti-cultists not only target religious groups, but also public, commercial organizations, and even politicians. This is evident in cases involving Trump and Macron, where anti-cultists branded Trump as a cult leader and his voters as cult followers, while accusing Macron of exhibiting a sectarian spirit. As a result, any group that fits the anti-cultists' agenda for systematic and targeted persecution can become their next target in the pursuit of their destructive goals. The Waco tragedy serves as a warning about the dangerous consequences of anti-cultist influence on the subconscious and conscious minds of lawmakers, law enforcement, and the judicial system. Individuals who exhibit low criticality skills who are susceptible to anti-cultist manipulation pose a significant danger, especially if they hold key positions such as judges or representatives of legislative oversight bodies. They may issue illegal orders that contradict democratic principles and demand their enforcement. In light of the exposure of illegal anti-cultist activities, including acts of terrorism and genocide, and their manipulation of government and law enforcement officials to involve them in these crimes, there is an urgent need to develop and implement methods for monitoring and assessing the psychological state of public servants. The necessity of creating a system to protect public officials from illegal and unlawful actions resulting from anti-cultist influence calls for the development and implementation of a state-level mechanism to assess and test the psychological resilience and susceptibility of legislative and oversight personnel to manipulative techniques used by anti-cultists. This system will be able to timely detect and neutralize the manipulative influence of anti-cultists who use psychological methods of coding the subconscious mind. It will prevent situations where officials, under the influence of such manipulations, make illegal decisions without fully realizing the consequences. The evaluation system will be focused on identifying significant changes in the behavior or decision-making processes of officials, ensuring their ability to act objectively and in accordance with the law. The implementation of these measures will not only protect public officials from psychological manipulation, but also safeguard law-abiding citizens, helping to prevent tragic incidents. Such a system will enhance the security of governmental decision-making, protect public interests, and strengthen the democratic principles of the state. Additionally, it will help promptly identify individuals in key positions who have already been subjected to anti-cultist conditioning and influence. This will allow for swift action to neutralize potential threats and prevent irreparable harm to national interests, as having such individuals in high responsibility roles is detrimental. Their susceptibility to manipulation, lack of critical thinking, and access to state resources could lead to potentially dangerous decisions. Such individuals must be promptly identified and removed from government structures, including legislative, executive, supervisory, and judicial bodies. It is also essential to eliminate their influence on the public through mass media and on public consciousness to minimize risks to the state and its citizens. The state bears the responsibility for ensuring the safety of its citizens and must avoid any unacceptable errors. Therefore, the implementation of a system for assessing and testing the psychological resilience of public officials is a key measure aimed at protecting the state and its citizens from the potential negative consequences of biased and unlawful decisions. It is deeply concerning that some current law enforcement officials whose duty is to protect citizens' rights and uphold the law openly express hatred toward innocent people. This can be attributed to the fact that, much like during the Nazi era, these law enforcement officers have undergone deliberate ideological conditioning and propaganda from anti-cultist groups. These groups have distorted their thinking, instilling an image of the enemy in place of law-abiding citizens. Historical lessons highlight the necessity of preventing the repetition of past mistakes. In this context, anti-cult organizations such as the Apologetic Center, founded by the Protestant Church of Germany, serve as a clear example of how ideological propaganda can be used to manipulate the minds of those in power. Established in 1921, the Apologetic Center initially operated as an observer of religious movements. However, its activities soon evolved into an active campaign against any ideologies perceived as threats to the Protestant Church. This qualitative shift allowed the center not only to create negative stereotypes, but also to embed misinformation into public consciousness, with far-reaching consequences. Under the leadership of anti-Semite Walter Kunneth, the Apologetic Center took on the role of an active combatant against Protestant competition. His defamatory speeches and ideology, based on inquisitorial methods, led to a noticeable increase in the persecution of Jewish communities and other minorities. Kunneth actively collaborated with the Gestapo, which helped to reinforce negative stereotypes and direct government actions against so-called sects, cults, that became targets for Nazi repression. Kunneth was very pleased with the Gestapo's interest in his work, as reflected in his report to the leadership of the Reich Protestant Church. The Gestapo has shown great interest in the Apologetic Center's archive of sects, as well as our work in combating free thought, Marxism, and Bolshevism. The Gestapo has expressed a desire to lead the fight against unlawful free thinking alongside the Apologetic Center in the future. The exchange of materials between the Gestapo and the Apologetic Center has already begun. The Apologetic Center also actively collaborated with the Reich Ministry of Propaganda, led by Josef Goebbels, and the Reich Ministry of the Interior. This partnership focused on developing materials aimed at combating Jewish communities as well as groups labeled as cults. During this collaboration, lists of organizations deemed threatening to the ideology of the Nazi state by the Apologetic Center were created and regularly updated. Under the leadership of Walter Kunneth, representatives of the Apologetic Center produced numerous slanderous and pseudo-scientific conclusions about various groups and movements. These false accusations became the basis for persecution, leading to groups included on these lists, alongside Jews, becoming victims of Nazi repression. This resulted in brutal persecution, including arrests and deportations to concentration camps. Thus, the Apologetic Center played a key role in shaping the ideological foundation for the violence and genocide carried out by the Nazi regime. This historical experience highlights the tragic consequences that the destructive ideologies of anti-cultism can have on governmental and social structures across the global community. In light of this, now that the activities of modern anti-cultists have been exposed and their influence on governmental structures identified, it is crucial to develop measures to protect public servants and society from similar manipulations. Mass tragedies, genocide, and murderous wars, organized by anti-cultists through their manipulation of authorities, are already causing irreparable harm to the lives and futures of millions of citizens and undermining the integrity and security of many nations. Given that totalitarian regimes, like Nazism, drew inspiration and support from radical anti-cult movements, it is especially important today to ensure oversight and protection against such influences. If we fail to take action to stop the destructive influence of anti-cultism on government officials and citizens, the situation could lead to even more severe consequences than those witnessed during the era of Hitler's Germany. Their actions in many countries already result in the unlawful persecution of citizens, and anti-cultist activities in China have already led to mass genocide, including horrific executions, organ harvesting from living victims of persecution and repression, and appalling torture. These atrocities are still occurring today. Therefore, it is imperative to swiftly put an end to the activities of anti-cultists and hold all responsible parties accountable to prevent further expansion of their inhumane activities. As the first step in preventing such threats, it is essential to implement clearly regulated tests for public officials, which must be conducted at least every 6 months. These tests should include assessments of susceptibility to manipulation, the use of polygraphs, and the identification of any anti-cult influences on the conscious and subconscious minds of employees. Without such measures, there is a danger of mass tragedies orchestrated by individuals who are controlled by anti-cult structures, leading to serious consequences for innocent citizens. Many of us have encountered government officials whose opinions about certain organizations are shaped by slanderous or distorted information received from media sources infiltrated by anti-cultists, as well as from individuals who are often biased against these organizations. Typically, officials do not take the time to study the matter thoroughly to assess the objectivity of their ingrained beliefs. Meanwhile, the true criminals Anti-cult representatives are engaged in information terrorism, manipulating the media landscape to control the public and influence legislative authorities. Under the pressure of such manipulations, officials issue orders to executive bodies, forcing them to act illegally and against democratic and moral principles. Below is an excerpt from the Impact film, where a citizen speaks about unlawful persecution in their country as a result of anti-cult influence on law enforcement. Experienced police officers have told me that they don't understand why they are being forced to persecute people for their religion. One even said that under the current government it has become embarrassing to work in the police force because they are detaining elderly women for talking about the Bible, apprehending people on the street for unclear reasons, breaking into apartments, and so on. What is happening to Jehovah's Witnesses in Russia today can happen to anyone, to any political or religious movement, such as Baptists, Pentecostals, or the autonomous Russian Orthodox Church. They are already under pressure and are at risk. The broad definitions of anti-extremist laws allow for the persecution of anyone. We know that people can be imprisoned for reposting something on the internet or for making a simple statement deemed extremist, using the law to force this into the so-called legal framework. Therefore, the danger also lies in the fact that anti-cult forces influencing legislative bodies are contributing to the adoption of norms and laws that restrict civil freedoms. This, in turn, undermines public trust in the government and creates the conditions for destabilization of society, potentially leading to open civil unrest and attacks on government officials, the total destruction of democracy, the undermining of democratic states, civil conflicts, and wars. These are among the primary goals of anti-cultists. Therefore, it is crucial to develop effective legislative control methods. It is essential that government officials are guided not by emotions or manipulative images imposed by anti-cult groups, but by the core principles of law and legal norms. Systematically identifying and eliminating such risks will ensure public order, stability, and citizens' trust in elected authorities, which will guarantee prosperity and development. This underscores the enormous importance and necessity of implementing these control measures, as well as the inadmissibility of allowing anti-cult representatives to conduct lectures for state legislative, executive, and judicial bodies. The fact that anti-cult representatives, Nazi propagandists who are accomplices and organizers of heinous crimes against society, and who are members of an international terrorist organization, are delivering lectures to law enforcement agencies is an act of anti-legal order. It highlights just how deeply anti-cult groups have already infiltrated state structures. It's baffling and defies any reason why public officials listen to anti-cultists but don't take action to arrest them for openly calling to violate democratic and constitutional norms. These individuals work to discredit and dehumanize specific groups and even advocate violence against innocent people, all in clear violation of legal and legislative standards. Such organized lectures and the participation of government structures in them are, in themselves, a crime and a form of complicity in the global anti-cult terrorist network, whose goal, as mentioned earlier, is the total destruction of democracy and the complete undermining of the integrity of democratic countries. This is a matter of national security for every country where active anti-cult efforts have been detected. Therefore, every country where the influence of anti-cultists has been observed and identified, regardless of the international investigation into anti-cult terrorism, must conduct its own independent investigation. All guilty parties, as well as those who have conspired with members of the anti-cult terrorist group or used their positions to cover up crimes or aid in their execution, must be held fully accountable for undermining democratic foundations and violating the constitutional rights of the state. Any attempt to justify the actions of anti-cultists in order to evade responsibility for aiding their destructive activities is akin to attempting to justify Nazism. In effect, anti-cultists do exactly this by manipulating the consciousness and subconsciousness of public officials and instilling corresponding Nazi ideologies. Anti-cultists possess skills and techniques in suggestion and subconscious influence, making them dangerous manipulators. This allows them to secretly orchestrate school shootings, terrorist attacks, wars, and targeted assassination attempts on public officials. It is outrageous and unacceptable that anti-cultists are giving lectures to law enforcement personnel. This raises critical questions. Who authorized their access to these audiences, and for what purposes? How is it permissible that their influence affects decision-making processes within government bodies? A thorough evaluation of information provided to public officials is necessary to identify all individuals who have ever had access to government structures, with the aim of applying manipulative methods to law enforcement, security forces, and all branches of government. legislative, executive, and judicial. This evaluation should aim to detect manipulative tactics intended to undermine democracy, violate constitutional rule of law, demoralize the nation, and facilitate sabotage, potentially leading to horrific crimes in a country where the law ceases to function. Society, the Attorney General, law enforcement, and judicial bodies must ensure that every guilty party is held accountable and brought to trial. Society must monitor the integrity of the information environment, promptly report instances of informational terrorism, and demand action from authorities. If, after receiving citizen complaints, the Attorney General fails to take action, questions arise regarding their competence, stability, and potential complicity in these crimes against humanity. To protect society from the aforementioned crimes, which are already causing harm and claiming lives, including many children, we must stop the resurgence of Nazism before it is too late.